Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about Tucker Carlson's interview with Darryl Cooper, an academic, and they were talking about the role of Winston Churchill or the role he played in World War II, and subsequent to that in the aftermath, and how that led to effectively the so-called liberal type style of mass migration, LGBTQ activism that we see, feminist activism we see today. That the groundwork for that, if you will, was laid at that time. Now, whether it was laid knowingly or unwittingly, is another thing. But I really want to talk about and put Churchill into some more perspective, and then how what role Churchill played, if any, really, and certainly whether it was a knowing role in the world that we see today, which is, of course, the globalist controlled mass migration and so on, which is not democratic at all. The globalists control all the Western world. They even control who holds political office, how long they hold it for, the policies that are enacted. There is no sovereign nation left anywhere in the West today. The globalists control everything. So to call that democratic and so on is beyond absurd. But anyway, coming back to Churchill. Now, when Churchill grew up, I mean, he's what I think he was born in 1874, 1875. Churchill grew up at the time when the British Empire was huge and great and powerful, had vast financial resources. On a relative basis, it was still the most powerful nation and empire on the face of the planet. The mere appearance of the British fleet off the coast of Africa or in the Mediterranean was enough to silence and cow. Christians were getting persecuted in the Balkans, and all it took was a British fleet to go cruising off the coast, and the message was driven home. There were African dictators that were trying to go back to the days of slavery. Again, all it needed was a British fleet to appear off the coast, and that'd be it. There was that was the power that the British had in the 1880s, 1890s, into the, I suppose, the very early 1900s. But that power was already at a time when Churchill was, say, 20 years old or in his early 20s, and he was a journalist and a war correspondent, in effect, always going to areas of where there was conflict, whether it be the Sudan or South Africa in the Boer Wars and so on. So he'd be getting around, and he was a man. He was a product of empire. If you were looking for the epitome of a product of empire, you would pick Churchill. Now, at the very time when Churchill was running around as a serious empire man, and he was, if anything, was that, the days of Britain's place in the premier place in the sun were already fast disappearing. The American economy was and we're talking time of Theodore Roosevelt, that sort of thing. The American economy was coming along very strong, and America was becoming a very populous nation, very technologically very advanced, very efficient. And there was also a united Germany that similarly was coming along very quickly. And so Britain's position as an industrial military power had already been surpassed by both the United States and Germany. And so this was hidden to some extent by what's called trade invisibles, such as things like finance, capital raising, insurance, freight. A lot of the world's freight was still carried on British ships and so on. But in terms of manufacturing goods and exporting them, Britain was already number three and even struggling to hold that position. And if you take away the sales of finished goods that Britain was effectively bartering with places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand and so on, if you took away the markets that were supplied provided by those places. Australia provided the wheat, and in return, the British would sell machinery and so on, finished engineered goods. So if you took away that, then the British position was really around fourth at the time. So Australia straddling the third and fourth. Now the difference between first and second Germany and the United States in industrial sense and third, that gap was already pretty decent. Now the Germans were at the cutting edge of a lot of the newer technologies, such as electronics, turbines, that sort of thing, chemicals, precision engineered metallurgy, that sort of stuff. The Germans were well ahead of the British in most of that, and the scale as well, and also the economies of scale. And the United States, a lot of the commentators from Britain that visited the United States, including people like W. Somerset Maugham, for goodness sakes, were commenting on that the Americans are the most efficient people in the world. And because they didn't have the class issues, the Americans, Germans too, actually, were able to more effectively utilize organizational people, in an organizational effective term. So the resources deployed, people's ingenuity, that sort of thing, were much more effectively done in places like the United States and Germany than they were in Britain. So already Britain's position of the world was slipping. It was no longer, it was the dying days of Britain as a great power. And that was already happening when Churchill was in his early 20s. The fact that Germany was not playing a big role on the world stage, or the United States, although Teddy Roosevelt's sort of fleet going around the world, that sort of thing, there were stirrings of that. But as America was not wanting to play a particular role on the world stage, although wanting, like as the Monroe Doctrine thing, wanting to have first priority in the Americas, and South America as well. But this still left Britain as the premier international power with a large fleet and a large merchant fleet. But again, the underpinning power of that, the industry and the industrial output, the quality of the industrial goods, the newer technologies, electronics, chemicals, and so on. Britain was already falling behind there. So Churchill was becoming a young man at the days when Britain was really starting to slide down the ladder. Now, even in World War I, Britain and France were not capable of, and Russia were not capable of defeating Germany. Already Germany's industrial capacity, the efficiency, the organizational structure, the quality of the industrial output, already Germany was a premier power, and Britain could not compete with Germany, even in 1914. So in between, say, 1897 and the British showing off their fleet at the Spithead exhibition in southern Britain, where pretty much all the heavies of the world came along to ooh and ah at the British fleet at the time. But instead of overawing the people that were arriving, the Germans, the Americans, and others, in fact, it whetted appetites, and a lot of the visitors looking at it going, "Hey, we need a fleet just like that, if not better." So it had, assuming it was a display of power, then it had the reverse effect to the one that I think might have been intended by the British at the time, to overawe the rest of the world. So we need to really understand that Britain was already sliding away. It was no longer the dominant world power when the new century came in. So when Queen Victoria died in 1901, that was really the end of the game there. The British already were no longer capable of fighting wars on an industrial scale. Now, the First World War was the first mass industrial war, and the Germans were much better at it than the British or the French or the Russians were. And it was a very close run thing that the Germans didn't win in World War I. Now, the purpose of the British in World War I was to prevent any one power on the continent, the European continent, of being completely dominant, whether it be the Napoleon, the French under Napoleon, or Louis XIV. It didn't matter, or the Spanish monarchy in the 1600s, 15 and 1600s, and so on. It didn't matter that the British policy was that they must prevent any one power from becoming dominant on the continent. Now that doctrine had already lost its usefulness. It was already out of date come the 1900s. The Britain had already been eclipsed. So Britain was imagining that it could still be the premier power if only it could stop any other power being dominant on the European continent. And of course, those days had already passed. The British elites hadn't realised it, but they'd already slipped to third place, and it wasn't even a close third. Remember, the combined industry and populations and so on of Britain and France weren't enough to defeat Germany in World War One. They still needed American help. Without American help, World War One, they would have lost. Now that had a big effect on Churchill. Churchill, I think, had already come to some extent realizing that the British, and he was very much into this English-speaking people things, were going to pass the torch to the New World, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think Churchill accepted that was the developing, if not the existing, status quo at the time. Even if the American involvement in World War One had been, say, 6 months later, it started the Germans would have won. That's the thing there, and it was again a close-run thing. Now, come World War Two, Churchill or Hitler rather had, I think, ill-advisedly signed. I mean, you could read it a number of ways. I guess the wording had some sort of wiggle room in it, but Hitler had unwisely signed an agreement saying that when Czechoslovakia was dismembered and the Sudetenland, which was an area adjacent to Germany but had been incorporated into Czechoslovakia, which was itself an amalgam of what today is Slovakia and Czechia together. The Neville Chamberlain and the various the French premier and so on had got Hitler to sign this thing saying that was your last territorial claim. You have no other territorial claims. Now, Hitler knew, everybody knew that the Polish corridor, that's where Eastern Germany, or East Prussia as it's called, was divided off from Germany by what was called the Polish corridor. So the Poles were given a narrow strip of land that divided Germany in two. Now, everybody knew that was an intolerable situation. So the idea that Hitler signed the thing, now you get the impression, looking at sort of Hitler's comments at the time, that agreement meant nothing. It was something to pacify the European public, like the French and British public, that really Chamberlain and I think it was Daladier, I think, knew that, from France, knew that Hitler wanted to address that issue. And Hitler knew that they knew, and they knew that Hitler knew they knew. So everybody knew it was an issue that's going to be addressed. Now, whether it could be achieved by negotiation with the Poles, who had this narrow strip of land dividing Germany into two, or what it was, that could be discussed. But when the German government approached the Poles to have negotiations, they were rebuffed and told to get lost and so on. So it was clear that a military option was going to be explored, and indeed it was. Now the British then threatened when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. The British gave, I think, the Germans a couple of days or something to withdraw, otherwise the war would be declared. Now, Hitler was prepared to create a rump state in Poland, similar to how Napoleon had done it, where it was sort of a greater Warsaw area, which was called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw by Napoleon. Hitler was prepared to create something along those lines to placate the British, but the British weren't interested and were determined. This is Neville Chamberlain, being the Prime Minister at the time, were determined that Germany had to withdraw and leave Poland intact. And the British went to war over Poland, yet in 1945, when the Russians occupied Poland and kept it as a communist satellite state, this was accepted by everybody, whereas World War II was kicked off by the British claiming that they were protecting Polish independence, but they didn't give a shit about Polish independence in 1945. or nowhere near as much concern as they had in 1939. So there's some inconsistencies there we could explore. And Churchill was still a heavyweight player in the 1940s, and again became premier in the 1950s of Britain. So when in May 1940, when the Germans launched that hugely successful invasion of France and absolutely crushed the French and British armies through May, June, July 1940, with a lightning campaign that no one anticipated, and was quite a shock, I think, to a number of observers. But it illustrated just how efficient the German military machine was compared to any other military machine in the world. But the British and the French had fallen in military doctrine, organizational structure, training, leadership, weaponry, had fallen far behind the standard that's now being set by the Wehrmacht. This didn't mean that the German tanks at that stage are necessarily more or better. The Char-B tanks and so on by the French, they were quite good. So it wasn't better tanks, it was just they were better organized, better structured, more effective tactics, better leadership training and so on. But how far, the British were never able to replicate that standard, never able to meet or even come close to that military standard during World War II, in spite of having all that time and all that ability to learn from the Germans. They still never met that standard. So, nor did the French. So this was something that Churchill was now Prime Minister in May, June 1940, and Hitler was pretty keen. Hitler wanted to be respected by the British, but Hitler had quite a high opinion of the Britain, the Empire, their accomplishments, their achievements. There's a lot of Germanic connections with the British. The British royal family had really been German for something 250 years or so at the time, and so they the large the Saxon population had moved to Britain after the Romans had evacuated. So a lot of German connection, and Hitler had and he wanted to be respected, but he wanted to be a leader held in great respect, as lower working class or lower middle class, working class type people do. It's very, very important to him, to Hitler. So he was quite prepared to offer the British generous terms, and Hitler didn't have an international empire on the horizon, certainly with none of his commentary. He wanted to be dominant in Europe, but didn't seem to care. Well, was quite happy to leave the British and their empire intact. So if the British had said, look, we won't oppose you anymore, okay, we like this outcome, please try and restore France to its, but we'll stop all military action. My feeling is, looking at the communications between Hitler and the various heavies in the German government at the time, I think they would have accepted that, and Hitler would have been over the moon about being respected and acknowledged as a great leader by the British. And I think that would have been enough for Hitler, from almost an ego perspective, I guess. So at this time, when the British have been so soundly defeated on the continent, our invasion's imminent. They don't have anywhere near the resources or the military capability to fight the Germans at this point, not even close. And even the German Navy, the pocket battleships, the Graf Spee and all that sort of thing, the British Navy's no match for them either. So the German planes are better quality than the British, and all these sorts of things combined. So the British have got no hope. The only hope they've got is that Britain fully surrenders its place as a premier world power to America, and that America takes it. So it's a bit. So now, as America enters the war, they take the view, as far as I can tell, is that it's a bit like children picking a nursing home, a retirement home for their parents. This was almost the view that they took of the British. I mean, the commentary that the American military had of the British military was so was so low that the Americans considered them incapable of sweeping the floor, let alone running military campaigns. So this Churchill accepted as a necessary, there's nothing else we can do. We have to pass the baton to the Americans, and because only they have the financial and industrial and population resources to prosecute the war. So Churchill was prepared to give up the British sovereignty or the extent of the sovereignty to the Americans on the basis that Britain could still have some place at the table. Churchill realised that Britain was not a player compared to the Germans or the developing Russian Empire. So this was a trade-off that Churchill made. Now, Churchill, I don't think, realised the extent of it, just how much it would negatively affect Britain. And the idea that if we've got to pass power off to someone else and we've got to play second fiddle, it's better if it's an English-speaking outfit that's doing it. And I think that was Churchill's position. So what did this unleash? Well, when the Americans entered the war, especially given the large Jewish population that come from, say, Russian Jews and that sort of thing, but also the alliance with Russia had allowed vast numbers of Marxist and communist activists that were heavily pushing feminism and things like that to enter the American media establishment and to push these international communist socialist views, which definitely took root at the time and they were tamped down to some extent, but not to a huge extent. The people that held these views, a large number of Jewish activists and so on, they still stayed in the United States and still became part of that international sort of network of, if we have an equal society, then Jews will never again be persecuted. That was a huge thing in the United States. And also the idea that the Germans had to be sort of re-indoctrinated in order to expel all the Nazi ideology, which was heavily over the view that this Nazi ideology, that the Americans imbued it with a power and a persuasion it never even possessed. So it was a bit like the projection today, where any straight white male is a Nazi and this sort of thing. It was that same stuff. So Churchill had opened the doors to a number, thinking that Britain's place at the senior table could be preserved for a little bit longer. Again, he being all misty-eyed about the days of empire, which he recalled as a young man. But Churchill, between the ages of Churchill being, say, 20 years old and then being 40 years old, Britain had already slipped absolutely into third or fourth place in world affairs. And this is something that I don't think dawned on Churchill properly. But the cost, the price Britain had to pay for pretending it still had a seat at the senior table was to allow the ideological introduction of the United States and the people driving that sort of stuff into again, selecting the nursing home and the retirement village. Now, Churchill is a man of empire. What was his role in World War II? Well, he was a galvanizing force, and he made good speeches. We will fight on the landing grounds and the beaches, these sort of things. It was all pretty hollow, though. If Hitler had, with determination, decided to invade Britain, there's nothing they could have done. It would have happened, but it was only Hitler's decision not to go ahead with it that saved Britain. It wasn't Britain's so-called plucky defence. Now, if Britain had if the Royal Air Force had gone down like a sack of potatoes or something when the Luftwaffe came over, that might have been different. So that Britain, the Air Force managed to hang on, just by the way, managed to hang on, and Hitler lost interest. But it was Hitler losing interest that became the issue there. If the Luftwaffe had kept up the pressure for a little bit longer, the Royal Air Force would have been broken. So this idea of plucky Britain fighting back, that's largely a myth-making business. The German military was far superior to the British military in all ways. And if Hitler had wanted to, the place would have been invaded. Then Britain got the war with Japan, which was obviously at a time when they were really unable to mount any major defence. But the defence that they could have mounted and could have been effective in, they were ineffective. It was a diabolically amateurish military that was opposing the Japanese, as evidenced by the surrender, the disgraceful surrender at Singapore. Churchill's still had these fits that Britain was a great empire with a great military that could pull off strategic masterstrokes around the globe and this sort of thing. This was well beyond Britain's capacity now. Japan was an advanced industrial nation, had a very good navy. The military was very good, very well trained, very well led, very capable. And Britain's military was no match for the Japanese and no match for the German military either. So again, militarily, Britain had fallen to depends how you look at it, fourth or fifth maybe in the military capability. Now, even the British military helped to the Russians, and the Russians were being defeated heavily by the Germans. In 1941, when the Russians were looking at the help the British military could supply, and they looked at it and said most of it was useless. So we'll give us raw materials, plate steel, these sorts of things. But the British tanks, they viewed as next to useless. Various other British weaponry, they viewed as next to useless. There were things that the Russians couldn't produce quickly and in sufficient quantity, like trucks or jeeps or things like that. So those the British could supply, but even those weren't good quality. The Russians looked at those, thought the quality was poor, and given that the low quality of the Russian stuff was really stark in terms of its just the poor quality control, and even they thought the British stuff wasn't much good. So that gives you an idea as to where the British were in this. But Churchill fancied Britain as being able to play sort of well above its weight, and therefore I think put Britain into a position where its decline was hugely accelerated by the decisions Churchill made. And now you can say that Britain won the war, and Churchill was but Churchill was a great towering figure in what he represented and what he projected, and the admiration that many of the people held him in, as he toured areas that were bombed out. He got applause and cheers and this sort of thing. But the reality is that as defiant as he appeared to be, and he represented this supposed plucky defiance and so on, the reality was that, or the effect of it was that Britain was being sold out, and its position as a substantial middle-ranking power, and certainly as a great power, had already melted away. And this was something that maybe was only obvious with hindsight, but I don't think so. There were plenty of commentators around at the time that were saying this trade-off that Churchill was making would ultimately be against Britain's interests, and it's turned out to be that. Now, was the people that cheered Churchill on back in the day the same people that cheered on, or that do cheer on today, the LGBTQ pride marches, or the radical feminist pussy wearing hats, or these sorts of things? No, I don't agree with that. Is there some crossover in sentiment? Yes, but are they the same people, or from the same ideological sort of schools? No, I don't think so. But there would be some common threads. You're being Tassos today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.